Now, to us anthropologists, the ontology that gives us the ground of nature as a universal and homogeneous substrate upon which are set the fragmentary forms of cultural diversity will be immediately recognizable as the default position adopted by generations of textbooks, a position that tends to be glossed by such non-specific words as Western and modern. Philippe Descola, in his treatise Beyond Nature and Culture, calls it naturalism. And for Descola, naturalism is one of four logically possible ontological schemas that underwrite the way human beings can organize their relations with one another and with the world they inhabit and render this world intelligible. The others are analogism, totemism, and animism. Now, this is not the place for an extended review of Descola's argument, but I would like to attend briefly to his account of animism, because by doing so I can both add some precision to what I mean by the relation between the life of the soul and soul life, and clarify the sense of one-worldness that follows from it. There is one characteristic of animism, Descola assures us, that everyone can accept. And this is, and these are his words, the attribution by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to their own. And by this he means that plants, and especially animals, are taken to be endowed with souls which enable them to act normatively and ethically as social beings, just as humans do. Against this homogeneous sea of souls common to all animate beings, there stands the diversity of exterior physical bodies that give each particular soul its executive armature and allows it to function in the world in the particular way it does. And in this regard, Descola thinks, animism is the perfect inverse of modern or Western naturalism, which gives us the diversity of forms of mental or spiritual life, or what modern people call cultures, set against the background of a homogeneous physical nature. Or, in a nutshell, whereas animism is a combination of similarity of interiorities and dissimilarity of physicalities, naturalism is the combination of similarity of physicalities and dissimilarity of interiorities. Now, all this sounds very neat until you start to wonder why naturalism, in the same breath that it extols the universality of nature vis-à-vis the diversity of cultures, also celebrates the boundless diversity of living kinds or species vis-à-vis the universality of the human mind and its conscious sense of self. What is similar and what is diverse depends on which way you look. And if naturalism can just as well be defined by the dissimilarity of physicalities and similarity of interiorities as by its opposite, then how can it any longer be distinguished from animism? And I think the answer is that compared with the similarities and dissimilarities of animism, those of naturalism are of another kind. In brief, naturalism's similarities are of identity, animism's similarities are of continuity, naturalism's differences are of diversity, animism's are of differentiation. And to amplify these twin distinctions, we can bring an earlier masterpiece of comparative anthropology, Roy Wagner's book, The Invention of Culture, to our aid. While for Descola, naturalism and animism are but two of four possible ontological schemas, Wagner offers only two possibilities. On the one hand are people who deliberately assemble life into collectivities and in so doing precipitate an idea of the world as made up of primordially discrete innumerable entities, otherwise known as individuals, and on the other hand, a people for whom the task is to differentiate life into separable streams, precipitating as they do an idea of the world as primordially undifferentiated. And for Wagner, these alternatives are exemplified respectively by middle-class Americans and the Daribi people of Papua New Guinea, among whom he carried out his fieldwork, the former broadly representative of Western modernity, the latter of tribal peoples. Well, let us, for the sake of argument, gloss over the obvious problems with the terms of comparison and allow the first to equate broadly to Descolat's naturalism and the second to his animism. And what interests me here is not where Wagner draws his lines between the West and the rest, but what he has to say about the self and the soul under the two contrasting ontological regimes. So under the first regime of naturalism, similarity means identity. We imagine a world of individuals, and these individuals can be counted. They can be aggregated into the kinds of collectivities we call societies, and they can be compared according to their intrinsic attributes. An attribute is deemed to be universal when it is common to every entity, and it is particular when it is limited to a narrower class of entities, or perhaps even unique to a single entity. Thus, we might claim that every individual human being possesses a sense of self, a singular seat of reason and conscience, and that this sense is therefore universal. But we might also claim that the mode of expression of this sense varies between one group of human beings and another, and class all those who express their selfhood in a certain way as members of one culture, and all those who express it in a different way as members of another. And we would, in so doing, establish what we take to be the fact of cultural diversity, although, as Wagner shows, this fact is really just the precipitate of a logical procedure. But under the second regime of animism, we start not with populations of more or less identical individuals, but with a continuum of yet to be differentiated relations. And out of this continuum, recognizable things have to be formed. And it is the task of life to do so. And yet in this process of formation, which carries on throughout life and is never complete, there always remains a memory of that undifferentiated potential from the interstices of which every being is drawn. And this memory is the soul. In a sense, the soul is a constant reminder of the viscosity of the relational field and of the effort that has to be put in to work against it. It is the reflex of life as a whole that is coiled up into each part, into each particular life, in the course of that very differentiation by which parts emerge from the whole. And in this regard, the soul is the precise obverse of the self. Under a regime of naturalism, the self may be disciplined in the work of creating a collectivity. It might be forced to conform to common standards. And yet its very persistence attests to the threat of decomposition, reminding us that without continued effort, the whole is liable to collapse into its individual constituents. But under a regime of animism, by contrast, the soul cannot be disciplined, but it can be lost, drowned in the very ocean from which it once was generated. So whereas the self casts its shadow on the inner walls of society, life as a whole carries the soul in the midst of its involute folds. Life in general, wrote the philosopher Henri Bergson in his book Creative Evolution, life in general is mobility itself. Particular manifestations of life accept this mobility reluctantly and constantly lag behind. So Bergson pictured the particular life thus as a kind of eddy or whirlwind, a circulation brought on by a swerve or deflection in the current of life itself that would otherwise proceed relentlessly on its rectilinear course. Life itself is an evolution. The cycle of every particular life is a revolution. The first, though it may be continuous with the second, cannot continue in it without being drawn aside from its direction, the Bergson's words. There is much in common between Bergson's vitalism and the animism I've just described, which casts the particular life as the life of the soul and life itself as soul life. We can, I think, take the one as a guide to the other. And in so doing, we can see that in the world according to animism, things are never ready formed, never fully precipitated from the matrix of their generation, but ever forming as concentrations of vital materials and energies that are and must remain perpetually in circulation. And everything that is, or better, everything that occurs, is immersed in the flow. So it is all very well to speak with Descola of the interiority of soul life. But this is not, as he would have it, an interiority set over and against the exteriority of bodies. It is rather the interiority of life that is immanent in the world itself and that participates directly in its relations and processes. So let us call this the interiority of immanence. And quite contrary to the interiority that is opposed to the physicality of the exterior world, the interiority of immanence runs seamlessly into physicality like the singular surface of a Möbius strip without any breach of continuity. Remember Bergson's comparison of the life cycle to the eddy in a stream. Can you tell what is inside the eddy from what is outside it? Of course you cannot, for the eddy is not a container and it has no content. It is a vortex, the form of turbulence. And as Bergson observed, though the life form, like the eddy, might appear to us as a stable thing with an inside and an outside, the appearance is deceptive, for in truth, the very permanence of form is only the outline of a movement. And every particular soul, likewise, is but an eddy in the flow of soul life, a vortex that continually winds and unwinds. It is a place not of rest, but of tumult. Only at the eye of the vortex does stillness reign. So here's the philosopher Michel Serres in The Birth of Physics, bearing his own soul. I quote, "I am myself a deviation, and my soul declines. My global body is open, adrift. It slips irreversibly on the slope. Who am I? A vortex." But if the differences of animism manifesting on the plane of immanence arise thus as singular vortices in the current, those of naturalism have broken off from it and lie strewn upon that plane of indifference, otherwise known as nature. The first are emergent and interstitial, the second resultant and superficial. So as whereas animism gives us a world of becoming, naturalism gives us a world of being. And it's the logic of naturalism operating from behind the scenes in Descola's account, which contrives to wrap every cycle of life into itself, thus converting the generative currents of its formation into a vital agent that is supposed to inhabit an interior divided off from the exterior world of its interactions with others. So there we have the flow with its vortices, and there the vortices have been contained and imagined as two individuals that are interacting with one another. In my call for an ecology of life, I want to escape from the deadening impact of this logic, to release the soul from its imagined incarceration, and to restore its turbulence to the circulations of the life world. It is to appeal not to the naturalistic dyad of identity and diversity, but to the animistic pairing of continuity and differentiation. So then the universal is not a lowest common denominator, but a field of continuous variation, not a plane of indifference upon which diversity is overlain, but a plane of immanence from which difference is ever emergent. Our focus then is no longer on the essence of being, but on its ongoing generation. That is to say, we should focus not on ontology, but on ontogeny. Now, I don't like the idea of turns. They are, for the most part, exhibitions of academic vanity. But if we must have such things to indicate transitions in our thinking, then let us call for a turn that is not ontological, but ontogenetic. With multiple ontologies, everything or every being is its own world, so that ultimately there are as many worlds as there are beings or things. But with multiple ontogenies, every being or thing issues forth along its own particular path, within a world of nevertheless unlimited differentiation. In short, ontogenesis allows us to reconcile singularity and multiplicity within one world. There is only one world, declares the philosopher Alain Badiou, but it is a world that refuses any normative preconditions for existing in it, such as might be entailed in any naturalistic definition of universal humanity. How many times have we attempted to define human nature in terms of the common possession of this or that attribute? Bipedalism, tool-making, pair bonding, language, symbolic thought, and so on, only to discover that there are creatures born of man and woman who lack these attributes and who consequently find themselves excluded or at least considered less than human. The one world we inhabit is not, however, reserved for what the anthropologist Donald Brown has called universal people, creatures of the normative imagination delineated by a suite of innate capacities and behavioral traits that all are supposed to share. It is rather a world of ever-emergent difference which admits no boundaries of inclusion or exclusion. In this world of becoming, though each of us may be different, these differences are constituted in and through the generative processes of life. They do not exist in spite of it. To point to similarities, by contrast, is to imagine a world already fragmented into its minimal constituents. In short, it is difference that connects, whereas similarity divides. The political theorist William Connolly makes much the same point, insisting that there is no identity without difference. To pit the universal against difference, Connolly writes, reduces the essentially relational character of difference to the bland idea of diversity among independent entities. It is, as we've already seen, to reduce the differentiation of becoming to the diversity of being. So to undo this reduction, we must put difference and the universal back together again. And this is what Badiou does. The single world, he argues, is precisely the place where an unlimited set of differences exist. Far from casting doubt on the unity of the world, these differences are its principle of existence. And I believe that anthropology should be fighting intellectually and politically for the recognition of this kind of world. So, what should we call it? In the year 1908, the American philosopher William James delivered the Hibbert Lectures at the University of Oxford, published in the following year under the title A Pluralistic Universe. James's proposed solution to the problem of the one and the many was to insist that the multiverse, as he called it, is simultaneously both singular and plural for the reason that its oneness is never absolutely complete. It is strung along, said James, not rounded in and closed. So regardless of the part or element on which you might choose to focus, at whatever level of exclusiveness or inclusiveness, there is always an overflow of relations. Wherever you are, there are further connections to be drawn, maybe direct, maybe through intermediaries. And in the drawing of these connections, even in their interpenetration, things lose nothing of their particularity. So, should we follow James and call our one world a multiverse or pluriverse rather than a universe? Well, yes and no. We may agree with the geographer and environmental philosopher Augustin Berg that the idea of the universe in its modern naturalistic sense, that is, as an objective exteriority that can be grasped only by the interior mind of a transcendental subject, that this negates all possibility of a world that is both supremely qualitative and totally unitary. And yet I would still want to enter one qualification, which goes back to my comparison of the conjunction and the preposition with as ways of joining. The Jamesian pluralistic universe is multiply connected, and yet its connections are conjunctive and not prepositional. They join things externally, on the outside. Pragmatically interpreted, wrote James, pluralism, or the doctrine that it is many, means only that the sundry parts of reality may be externally related. Everything you can think of, however vast or inclusive, has on the pluralistic view a genuinely external environment of some sort or amount. Well, that seems plain enough. Indeed, the Jamesian multiverse is rhizomatic in every way. It is and, the very model of an assemblage. And yet, the passage that immediately follows in James's text is more equivocal. Things are with one another in many ways, James goes on, but nothing includes everything or dominates over everything. The word and trails along after every sentence. Something always escapes. And notice how in this passage, James starts with and only then resorts to and perhaps he would have liked to have it both ways. This dilemma has not gone away, nor has the question it raises. Is our world a patchwork of multiple realities, irregularly stitched across their rough, unmatched, and sometimes overlapping edges? Or is it more like a braid, a thing of entwined and ever-extending pathways binding longitudinally rather than transversally along their lines of growth and movement? Writing from his perspective as a student of science and technology, John Law has recently presented an answer of the first kind. His concern is to offer an alternative to the idea that everything there is can be made to fit into a single container universe, or what he calls the one world world. In such a world, anything that cannot be made to fit, anything that flies in the face of universal reality, is simply dismissed as an instance of belief, and mistaken belief at that. In a world divided between colonized and colonizers, what is truth for the colonized is mere belief for the colonizers. Though, as law shows, the same logic has long been at work in the societies of the colonizers as well. But it is a logic that fails in a post-colonial era in which different and incommensurable realities grind against one another with no assurance of reconciliation or containment. We now live, says law, in the era of the fractiverse, a set of contingent, enacted, and more or less intersecting worlds in the plural. Those are law's words. Worlds in the plural. So we seem to be back where we started, with many as opposed to one. And perhaps this is because of law's focus on the being of things rather than on their becoming, on ontologies rather than ontogenies. The realities, multiple as they are, seem in law's account to have already fallen out from the matrices of their generation. So to recover the oneness of the world, should we not move upstream and correspond with things in the moment of their appearing, rather than assembling what has already appeared on the conjunctive hook of an and? And this is, in effect, to seek an answer of the second kind. Returning to the philosophy of James, but in the context of contemporary geopolitics, anthropologist Arturo Escobar, who spoke to you yesterday, hints at just such an answer. For Escobar, the one world, of course, is the globe of corporate capitalism, epitomized in the celebrated logo of the World Bank, with its perfectly gridlocked sphere shorn of life, elements, and people. This is indeed a world that is rounded in and closed, as James would have put it, and in which everything there is has been reduced to liquid commensurability. It is a world of commodities and monetary values from which people are overwhelmingly marginalized, if not actually locked out. Now, against this global world, and with acknowledgement to James, Escobar reintroduces what he calls the pluriverse. It might be described, he writes, as a process of planetarization articulated around a vision of the earth as a living whole that is always emerging out of the manifold biophysical, human, and spiritual elements and relations that make it up. So unlike Law's fractiverse, Escobar's pluriverse is unambiguously with. It is prepositional, not conjunctive, and its plurality arises not from chains of exterior connection, that is, of things strung along, but from the cascades of individuation or interstitial differentiation by which the earth as a living whole, to borrow Escobar's words, is continually emerging. And I think it is to the one-worldness of this whole that anthropology must remain committed. As I stated at the outset, the world is a conversation. It is not the object of our conversation. In this conversation lies ontogenesis, the becoming of being. And it is high time to restore ontogenesis to life. We will then see that every particular life is both an open-ended exploration of the possibilities of being that our one world affords, and a contribution to its ongoing formation, that is, to its worlding. It is, in this sense, a never-ending quest for an answer to the problem of what being human, or what living in this world actually means. But every answer is a response and not a solution. Responding to the question, we respond to one another. That is, we correspond. And in this, we do not so much look out from a position as long for one that is forever beyond our grasp. Life is a question to which there is no answer. But in this one world of ours, we are all tasked with looking for it, and it is in the search that all life is lived. And it is just as well that there is no final solution, for that indeed would put an end to us all. Thank you very much.